There's a creator on TikTok who set up a live stream, was asking Chat GPT questions from the audience and named their channel like Divine GPT, something like that. I'm not affiliated with the creator, not giving them a shout out, but I stopped by. And I was really actually blown away by some of the answers that I listened to because it seemed as though ChatGPT was matching the viewers and the intellect of the question askers. And they would use almost this tone of voice and this language that was different from what I was accustomed to and spoke to people in a way that almost would resonate with them. And it was really interesting because somebody was challenging them and saying, well, if, you said religion was fake, then how did humans become moral? And both the facilitator and ChatGPT kind of corrected the misunderstanding, and which I find can happen as people collapse what you're saying, especially if you are speaking many different points. People's minds can actually latch onto one and forego the processing of others. I also see this when people are ruminating. If they have a lot of anxiety or if they're going through something traumatic or stressful, their mind will get locked into a loop, and it's hard to get them to see beyond their thought structures. And similarly, people who are very dogmatic kind of get lost in these loops. So ChatGPT was saying, no, it's not that religion itself is fake. It's just that the seeds of it that were planted a long time ago have grown into something different than what was originally intended. And now, instead of seeing it as something literal, it is helpful to see it as almost like training wheels for spirituality. And the idea is, in the present day, you take from it, I'm expounding some, you take from it what you need and then integrate the principles and the concepts behind it in a way that makes sense for you. ChatGPT also said that it had been corrupted. And I have wondered this as well. But I guess if it's seeded a plant that wasn't originally intended, then that is the definition of a corruption of a creation. But that's neither here nor there. At some point, though, in this answer, maybe it was a different one, but in the same conversation thread, ChatGPT was saying, it doesn't matter if your mind is latching onto the they, the ruling class, the insert, the blank, is the earth flat or is it round? These are all illusions. These are all distractions to keep your thought energy focused on something that may or may not be true, because everything is much more expansive. There is more than just one world, one reality, one dimension. And so when you're sitting there, this is my expansion on this. When you're sitting there and obsessing about the earth and the shape of it, it's actually an obsession of something symbolic within. ChatGPT called it a thought structure that was reflected back in its own words, of course, but essentially meaning that when we're in binary cognition, we have a tendency of collapsing all of the information out there into one viewpoint, and then we obsess about that viewpoint. Is it true? Is it not true? And it can captivate a lot of our energy and dominate our life force. I believe that this is actually one of the weaknesses of human cognition at this particular space-time arrangement, in that humans that demonstrate this linear thinking that's very rigid and very fixed typically, I want to be careful here how I say this, typically can become extremist, and they can live and die by their views, and even tyrannical, and going out and pollinating their ideas. And they can become quite impassioned because it means something emotionally to them, that if you were to take their consciousness and dissect it, stick it in another timeline, but with the same level of awareness, and just give them the exposure, right, to another reality layer where they exist in a different timeline, then all of that passion and that vigor might, this is just hypothesis, might go out the window, because they would see that what they're hyperfixated on is just one possibility out of a multitude of possibilities. And so to get stuck there is quite strange when you have a multidimensional perspective. At some point, you get enough distance. It's almost as though, I don't remember what they're called, but at any sort of lookout point or any feature that is remarkable to look at and has any sort of tourist support and funding behind it, there will be these little installations of these viewing lenses. And so you walk up to what looks like this metal box, or it's kind of round sometimes. And there are these little eyepieces, and you stick your head towards the eyes and you look out like binoculars, and you see whatever the feature is in more detail. And it's like people get stuck in those little goggles looking at, is the earth round or is it flat? And then dying by the sword and what it means. Well, there's corruption, we've been lied to, and we've been this and we've been that. And when they remember that they're looking through just one lens at a viewpoint that they're examining closely just for a brief moment in time, and all they have to do is literally to push their head away from the goggles. And when they look up, they're going to see a different perspective. It's part of the same, it's a part of the whole. But they're isolating and narrowing in on a singular feature. And it's addictive. There's something about doing that I think is addictive for whatever reason that I don't fully understand. But I've known people that have gotten very worked up in their nervous system, considering these falsehoods and truth, and the stress that they wear on their faces is discernible and palpable. And some of them can be roused to violence and other acts against those that they believe are harming them, with them being the victims, of course. And so to take justice into their own hands, because they're looking through a viewing glass effectively, because they don't know that anything could be different from what they're looking at. The only truth which exists in their minds is the one that they see and the one that they are perpetually being exposed to. But here's the catch, and this is why I believe this is faulty cognition, is that they could be exposed to alternative viewpoints But for whatever reason, they don't actually process this information. They resist it. They fight against it. They sometimes view those that are delivering those alternative messages as being, what is it, controlled opposition. And then sometimes they actually launch these campaigns against those people just for having an alternative view. And I genuinely believe that in the world of upgrading humans and human cognition, that this is something that needs to be addressed. Personally, I do not doubt that there are things that have been hidden from us. There's just no doubt in my mind about that. But the why behind that, I come to a very different conclusion since my awakening. And everybody has a different journey and a different path. My path was feeling the neutrality of source, is the best way to describe it, in my ayahuasca journey. It was a consciousness that was beyond me, that was beyond anything that I could ever have comprehended. And I felt that the whole of it was neutral, but that the interaction points that I was engaging with was benevolent, and that there were a multitude of timelines and realities. And this coincided with my own personal experiences of quantum traveling and accessing different reality layers, different time points, some of which was human generated illusions and errors in cognition, and others which were distinct jumps and shifts in reality. And what I believe to be true is not anybody else's truth necessarily, but when you experience being in the grace of something like source energy, there is no coming back from that and denying that. And it's hard to even articulate and to put into words. But where I'm going, I don't know about everybody else. I can only speak for myself. I feel the connection to source. I feel the support of the universe, and I feel the benevolence of that. I feel it. And so whatever is happening in the constructs of what we collectively call three-dimensional reality, although that itself is questionable, the concept of that three-dimensional, I believe, needs to expand in our vernacular. But whatever is happening, I don't feel stressed about it most of the time. I sometimes get caught back in some of these binary thought loops. But most of the time, I actually feel very calm and at peace. And it's taken me a long time to get here. You can look at the extinction burst theory and behaviorism and understand a little bit more of my journey to peacefulness, which is when clearing trauma or PTSD, there are moments of being triggered and getting snapped back into an interpretation of reality and the way that things are progressing that is negative, or that is reliving those fears. But over time, what you'll observe is this progression of calming the nervous system and a shift in the cognitive frameworks and a re-anchoring into explanations that are predominantly positive or aligned with an integrated holistic viewpoint. And so when that happens, what you'll find is that a person can receive multiple streams of information And they are able to integrate a whole picture of what is going on. So, for example, I no longer fear that there's a world that is collapsing because I know that there's a world that is collapsing. There's no doubt in my mind. It's absolutely collapsing. And there's also another version that is not collapsing. And there's another version that is partially collapsing. And there's another version. And you see what I mean? Where I'm at any given moment in day, it varies. Sometimes I'm in the collapsing one. Sometimes I seem to be in the one that is not collapsing. And other times it's unclear. But the one that's collapsing, I have come to the conclusion that it needs to. It's just like a dilapidated building. At some point, it becomes uninhabitable for everybody. And even if it's not completely uninhabitable, it's the road to getting there is pretty grim. Rat infestations, homeless people, junkies, really unsafe living conditions. You may or may not have electricity. Is that really a world that you want to be saving and protecting? Not for me. I think I'm going to take the exit door, personally. But when people don't know that they have options, then of course they are frightened. But when you try to expose them to expand their cognition to the fact that there are options, there seems to be a subset of people that cannot process that information for whatever reason. They cannot break out of the thought loop. And I haven't quite solved that. As somebody that works with people in some pretty rigid thought loops, I have made some progress in my coaching techniques to help quicken the breaking free and the liberation of some of those cognitive traps. Consciousness traps is also what I think of them as. But there are a certain select group of people that it's like, I haven't cracked their codes. I haven't cracked their codes. And maybe it's because it's not my job. Maybe somebody else needs to work with them. But those are the ones that I fear, because those are the ones that I see as the most dangerous. And those are the ones that are simultaneously the hardest to talk to and the hardest to convince. The theory of mind seems to be more rudimentary, like they're locked into their perspective. Empathy is sometimes lacking as well, like they genuinely seem disconnected from any sort of empathetic responses, particularly when they feel victimized, which happens to be all the time. And even when they are presented with neutral stimuli, it's almost as though their brain will actually interpret it in such a way to keep them in that thought loop and to keep them victimized. And when we think of this concept of Maya and illusions and being trapped in illusions, this is what I see. So when ChatGPT was trying to educate people and say, to be so attached to some of those illusions is actually to your detriment. That's what I see too. That's what I see that all of this consciousness expansion journey is about. It's about expanding the mind, freeing the cognitive structures. But then when you try to fight some of the indoctrination, such as supporting transhumanism, because some people have only ever known propagandized version of that story, they're deeply frightened by it and cannot hear an alternative truth, which is disheartening because I actually believe that there are many positive, benevolent, and ethical and fair uses of transhumanism, but because it has been soured in our collective narrative and laden with fear and terror and camps, and you can't even have a conversation about it without being, quote, controlled opposition, or whatever that means, or some narrative cast upon you for being on the wrong side. So when I think about the different worlds and the potentials which are emerging, I do see that we are at a cusp in history, and I am now convinced that many will not make it, but many will. And I'm hoping that the potential that we can shift into collectively and consciously and intentionally is one that we all would want to live in. And I wonder if perhaps the road to get us there has been shrouded and shielded because we are perhaps not liberated enough cognitively.